Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. As you can see, I'm still slightly rearranging my whiteboard just to get the best possible view and the least possible glare. So today we're going to follow on from the generic stuff that we did on market failure and look specifically at one particular market failure in this episode, negative externalities. You all know the score by now. If you want to participate with Coffee with Mr. V, go and grab yourself a coffee. If you can make it as economicsy as that mug, I'll be impressed. Or if you don't like coffee, go and grab your favorite liquid, put it in a mug, a glass, or a cup. Come back to the video and we will do the synchronized sip, and that's going to be the best part of your day. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, I love coffee. So this is, I think we talked about it very slightly in the last episode. This is the negative externalities diagram. Externalities, remember, are a negative spillover on the third party. First party, consumer; second party, producer; third party, Joe Random. Somebody who is, visually just think about some random person walking down the high street in Headington who has nothing to do with the private transaction that's going on between the consumer and the producer. And in that market, then you have a demand and a supply curve. And again, just to reiterate, where does that come from? It comes from the marginal private benefits or the marginal private utility that we gain from consuming that product. As we consume more things, the marginal utility that we get from each additional product starts to fall, hence the downward sloping demand curve, and an upward sloping marginal cost curve because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. And if we left this to the free market, we would have the intersection at QFM, FM standing for free market. But what we know is that actually consuming this good has an externality on a third party that we should, if we're really good economists, that we should take into account. So the way that we do this now, if it's a negative externality in production, that is when we make it, that's when you get the negative spillover on the third party. So things like CO2 emissions, air pollution, noise pollution, visual pollution, all of those ideas. Then you impose it diagrammatically on the producer, as you'll see that you can actually do it on the demand curve if you're doing the IB. And if you're doing any other A-level board apart from Edexcel, Edexcel seem to have left this out, but never mind. So we put it onto the producer. And what we say, since this is a private cost curve, this is the marginal cost on the firm of producing this good. But then there is an externality, an external cost onto this third party, which we should consider as well. Sorry, didn't mean to wipe that off. So if it cost that much to make the good, but then it also incurred that straight line distance there, because remember, we could put numbers on if we wanted to, but the great John Maynard Keynes actually said that economic diagrams use their impact when you start putting numbers on there, because you can always critique the numbers, but if you leave the numbers off, if you just leave the idea is much more important. If it costs us that much to make it, but then there is an external cost of that much on top, that's where the full economic cost is now realized. And we could do that for all units. So not just for the first unit, but also the second unit, the third unit, the fourth unit. And we could keep going and keep going and keep going. And then you could you could line up all of those dots, and then you would get a new curve, which we know as marginal social cost curve. And marginal social costs, in fact, let me do this in different colors just so that you can onto the diagram. Marginal social costs equal the marginal private cost to the firm plus the external cost. And that straight line distance there is the external cost. So we've got the cost of making it to the firm plus the external cost, the cost on Joe Public walking down the street, the fact that he or she is now breathing in polluted air, and therefore that has an additional cost in terms of healthcare costs. And therefore we get the total marginal social cost, the total cost on society. There we go. Sometimes in textbooks, you may see the two lines diverging like that. I guess that's perhaps saying that, the way I've always thought about that is perhaps saying in higher quantities, the concentration of that pollution or that negative externality is greater. So actually, maybe we should account for a greater externality at higher output levels. But doing a parallel shift is absolutely fine. We can do the same thing with the demand curve, but it's highly unlikely that you'll ever get a scenario in which there are positive and negative externalities in the same diagram. So therefore, to talk about social benefits, it's probably the same line, and I'll do exactly the same here, okay? Marginal social benefits, the benefits to the first, second, and third party is just the same as the formula above. It's marginal benefits, private benefits to the first party, plus any external benefit to the third party. But since there is no external benefit to the third party of, say, cement production or paint production or anything, then actually EB is 0 and MPB equals MSB, marginal social benefits. Then what we do, or what we should do as good economists, is look where the social costs equal the social benefits, and we get Q sol, which, as I explained in the last episode, I would call the socially optimum level. This is when resources should be allocated. That sounds like a very normative statement, should be allocated. The justification for that is that community surplus or social surplus is maximized at the socially optimum level. Why is it maximized there? Because, again, let's use the lines. The social benefits, in fact, I'll do this in a different color so as not to confuse people. The social benefits up until Q sol are greater than the social costs. So all of that there is community surplus. Every unit of output between 0 and Q1, the social benefits are outweighing the social costs. So that's what economics says. That's an efficient use of resources. We should be making more of these things. Beyond Q sol, though, and you can see that the numbers now change. We've gone past that intersection, and anything past that intersection means that the social costs are now greater than the social benefits. It's a waste of resources to make those things. But as you can see, in the free market, where there is free market provision, where people are self-interested, producers and consumers, where we don't care about Joe Public, we only care about ourselves, we would actually allocate all the way up to QFM. And that's bad because for these units at QFM, social costs are bigger than social benefits. And so we can draw this triangle there, which represents the welfare loss. Okay, there is actually a welfare loss to society of producing those units. It's a waste of resources. It's an over allocation of resources. It's an inefficient allocation of resources. It is a market failure. Now, I'll very quickly just have a look at this from a demand perspective. So if you're doing the Edexcel A-level, you will never have to do it like this until they change the spec. But if you're doing the IB, if you're doing any other exam board, then you will have to do it like this, and quite rightly, because actually this is good economics. What we say is, if the negative externality comes from the consumption of the good, so things like cigarettes, things like alcohol, things like, I don't know, increasingly sugar is seen as a demerit good, that there are negative externalities in consumption, then we should shift the demand curve rather than the supply curve. And the justification for that is to say, well, actually, that's the benefit that you got as the consumer, but you should subtract the external cost, because actually society doesn't benefit as much as that overall, because there is an additional external cost when it is consumed. And you could do that for all units. So for example, although I'm consuming beer here, I'm consuming that first unit of beer at the weekend, I'm getting a lot of utility from that. But because of the external cost of my consumption, external costs of alcohol might be something like the increased likelihood of fights in the town centre, litter, vandalism, the increased cost in the NHS of people with alcoholic illnesses. There is actually less social benefits going on because of this external cost going on here. And we could do that all the way along, and this would be our marginal social benefits here. Marginal social benefits would be underneath the marginal private benefits. The same analysis then. Here is QFM. Assuming there are no externalities in production, we can take this then to be the socially optimum level. And what you should hopefully see then is that this is exactly the same. The conclusions that you reach from whether you do it on the supply curve or the demand curve, you always get to the left of QFM. Negative externalities left to the free market will lead to underconsumption / overproduction of a particular resource. And it will lead to welfare loss. Here, go back to my orange pen. Here, my social benefits are greater than my social cost. There's my community surplus being maximized at the socially optimum level. But given that the free market took us all the way over to here, here is my welfare loss triangle. And you can see, again, the diagrams are very similar. The triangle is pointing to the left, pointing towards the socially optimum level, the welfare loss triangle, that is. So there's the diagrammatic analysis of negative externalities as a market failure. That's the diagram that you would need to be drawing. Well, so what then? Well, so the next logical step is to say, well, how might you go about fixing this? I would say that there are three main ways of fixing this. First of all, an indirect tax. I mean, there's no particular order to do this. An information campaign, and a minimum price. It kind of works better if you do them underneath each other, because then you can start to line up the various quantities and you can hopefully show that they will fix the market failure exactly. So that's what I'm going to try and do now, and hopefully I won't run out of space too much. So there is QFM. Now the black lines are just meant to represent the demand curve and the supply curve as in the free market. And what we're doing now is we're going to impose an indirect tax onto the good in order to reduce consumption, because we're over consuming. We need to get back to the social optimum level. And that's how we fix market failures. If we can reduce consumption back to the socially optimum level, then consumers' community surplus is maximized, and therefore we have fixed the market failure. So you remember from previous episodes when we've looked at indirect taxes are imposed on the producer, and they raise production costs, which shifts the supply curve to the left. There you go. And look, the new intersection, the new equilibrium is now at Q sol rather than QFM. I have fixed the market failure. You could do it through an ad valorem tax rather than a percentage tax. Again, you just need to make sure that the intersection is in line with Q sol. If it is, you have fixed the market failure exactly. Evaluations then for things like that, well, you need to try and get the tax exactly right. If I had put a tax here, then look, I've actually gone past the socially optimum level. That's just as bad. That's an example of government failure. Yeah, now we are not producing enough. We still haven't maximized community surplus. In fact, you will only fix the market failure exactly if the tax is exactly equal to the external cost. Other evaluations might be things like people might want to try and avoid the tax if they can. The PED for the particular product might be inelastic, and therefore, any sort of tax, people might not be sensitive to that price change, and therefore the Q might not shift down to the socially optimal level enough. All right, let's have a look at another one. So again, look what I'm doing, and this is why I would always advise drawing the solutions underneath the problem, because you can line it up. There's my supply curve, there's my demand curve. We're trying to get back to that socially optimum level, Q sol. So in this scenario, I will set a minimum price, a price below which producers are no longer able to sell a particular product. And I'm going to put it exactly there. The reason I'm going to put it there is that you can see the new intersection of the minimum price with the demand curve, how much people are willing and able to buy, is at the socially optimum level. I have successfully reduced consumption back to the appropriate socially optimum level. Suppliers want to sell more, But since we've contracted along the demand curve, they won't produce there. Okay, they won't produce there because if they were to produce there, they'd simply have unsold stuff. They will produce to there only. So that does various things to consumer and producer surplus that I won't go into here, but it successfully reduces consumption back to the socially optimum level. Again, I have fixed it. Possible evaluations that you could do. You could talk about raising the minimum price too high or not raising the minimum price enough. You can talk about how this is inflationary. You could also talk about how it's almost regressive. This is going to affect lower income households much more than higher income households because that particular price as a percentage of income is much more for a lower income household than a higher income household. You could also talk about the formation of a black market in which people who are willing to pay just under the minimum price and producers who are willing to produce and sell at under the minimum price might get together on an informal market away from government regulation and buy and sell. And that happens quite frequently with things like cigarettes and alcohol. Finally, then, information campaigns. So again, I'm drawing my demand and supply curve with the original intersection at the same place, QFM. The purpose then of a information campaign is to change people's behavior by giving them more information about the fact of, what they're doing, how it's affecting the third party, and perhaps getting them to voluntarily reduce their consumption of a particular product. So what we're hoping to do is affect change on the demand curve. We're hoping that the demand will, as we go back to week 1 economics, demand curve should shift to the left. And if we successfully shift the demand curve enough, then we get back to, again, a new intersection at the socially optimum level, and we have successfully fixed the market failure. We are at the socially optimum level of output. Potential evaluations for this then, well, maybe it will be ineffective. What's to say that people will actually take any notice of the information campaign? Maybe it's an expensive information campaign to run. These things don't come cheaply, and the government doesn't have unlimited funds, despite what Rishi Sunak's telling you at the moment. And we don't have unlimited funds, or it may simply be ineffective. They might roll it out, and it might not reach half the population because maybe the population isn't watching telly at that time, or maybe the population doesn't see it or listen to it on the radio. So there are different reasons, or people might just deliberately ignore it. Okay, maybe they listen to it, but they're desensitized to it, a little bit like the information campaigns on cigarettes. Very impactful at the beginning when they started putting pictures of kind of people's horrible illnesses on the front of cigarette packets. But if you grow up with that, then you're desensitized to it, and it doesn't have as much of an impact on you later on. So anyway, there you go. All I've tried to do here then is look at negative externalities, the diagrammatic illustration, and how we represent negative externalities on the diagram. And we've been through 3 potential solutions. I can show you again diagrammatically how each of them is meant to solve the problem of market failure. But as good economists, you should always be looking at the alternatives. You should always be thinking, is this really going to survive contact with the real world? Because economic models are there to provide us with a structure, but the real work goes on to, well, will this work in real life? Will people respond to this in the way that we're expecting them to do? Or will something else be happening? And I think with each of these cases, with each of these scenarios, there is a case to say, well, actually, there may be a reason why people aren't responding to it in exactly the way that was intended. And with that, I'm going to leave you and enjoy the rest of the week. See you soon.